Gonaschish Keihéenák'w Khatsa T'agsmåtéichén gitchoscha Hasta T'aḳdeintaan Keihéenák'w T'aḳdeintaan T'aćeich Tlingit Gonaschish Keihéenák'w Khatsa T'agsmåtéichén gitchoscha Hasta T'aḳdeintaan Keihéenák'w T'aḳdeintaan T'aćeich Tlingit.
Understanding the Tlingit verb. Video lessons for becoming a Tlingit speaker. This video series is brought to you by the Goldbelt Heritage Foundation. For more about their programs, visit www.goldbeltheritage.org. These lessons build upon the tireless work of countless elders, speakers, linguists, teachers, and learners who have collectively fought for our language. Gunnachish. Basic Tlingit verbal structure. Keihéenák'w. Identifying components and conjugating verbs, objects, and subjects. We'll begin by looking at pronouns in Tlingit. There are 66 Tlingit pronouns, and they fall into 5 basic categories: independent, possessive, object, subject, and postpositional. We'll take a look at all of these over time, but for now, let's focus on a small group of them. Independent pronouns include chat, uhan, wa'eh, yuhan, hu, ka, ut. And possessive pronouns include ha, ye, ka, ut. The left-hand column is a series of symbols which require a little bit of explanation. First of all, we have singular and plural. Single would be one, plural would be more than one. Beyond that, there's a series of first person, second person, and third person, which basically means first person is the speaker, second person is someone being spoken to, and third person would be someone being spoken about. On the bottom, we have independent human and independent non-human, which require more explanation, which will be given later. Let's start by taking a look at independent and possessive pronoun examples. On the left-hand side, we'll start with independent pronouns, which are not attached to anything grammatically. Here we have gusu wa'eh, ya tu khat, khatsu achtuwu yak'e. In these 3 samples, there are grammatical things going on, but there is a lack of verbs tied to these independent pronouns. The independent pronouns are wa'eh, khat, and khat. Now let's take a look at the possessive pronouns. Our phrases here are Keihéenák'w, T'agsmåtéichén, and khatsu achtuwu. Notice the repeat of the last one, which contains both independent and possessive pronouns. Moving through these, the pronouns are and d, and ach. This wraps up our discussion for now of independent and possessive pronouns and prepares us for our next set, the subject and object. To begin with, we'll look at these examples in English, and we'll keep in mind that English prefers to put the subject before the verb and the object after the verb. The subject is the agent of the verb, the one who does the action, and the object is the recipient of the verb, who is impacted by the action. Looking at these sample sentences in English, we see the subject who is performing the verb as dog, mouse, you, I, and who. The objects of these sentences who are impacted by the verb are cat, cheese, me, pencil, and whom. Pay attention to the word order of these sentences and how English prefers to have subject, verb, object. Before we begin to talk about subject and object pronouns in Tlingit, we need to take a step back and look at Tlingit verbal structure. This is something you'll be analyzing regularly as you study Tlingit. Whether you're doing this scientifically, with charts and code and individual pieces of grammar and morphology, or whether you're just trying to internalize that as a speaker and mimic what you see fluent speakers doing naturally. But to begin conjugating verbs, at some point you're going to have to analyze the fill-in-the-blank nature of some of these components in the Tlingit verbal structure. To begin with, this is a chart developed by Seth Cable and James Crippen based on other charts developed by Jeff Lear, Richard Noor Dowenhauer, and Kerry Eggleston. And what they try to do is to allow us to visualize the different components of the Tlingit verb. Before we become overwhelmed with these 26 different components, let's just start thinking about the fill-in-the-blank nature that we're talking about here. Many of these components share a space, and if something comes into that space, it locks it up. We can think of this like a slot machine. As it spins around, we can see each one come up with a certain component, and that component locks up the slot, whether it's a lemon, a number, or cherries. This is oversimplifying Tlingit grammar to a point, but it's just allowing us to get started and see where we can start filling in some of these blanks. The one thing that varies between the slot machine and Tlingit grammar is Tlingit grammar will start to slide between those slots, move slots to other locations as sounds interact with each other in what we call morphology, which is where adjoining sounds change each other's shape and quality and create new sounds we call contractions. So let's step away from the verb complex structure and just think about what a verb is in Tlingit. A verb in Tlingit is a single word that is made up of a prefix, a stem, and a suffix. This verb is often surrounded by what we call pre-verb material and post-verb material, which are words that combine to affect the total verb phrase. When we're analyzing Tlingit sentences, we have to take all of these things in mind, but for now, we'll just focus on the verb itself. In this lesson, we'll be looking at how objects and subjects function in Tlingit verbs, but in order to get to that discussion, we have to break down the verb itself, and part of that involves the preverb material. In the preverb, you have plural markers for both the object and subject third person, you have some object markers, and in the prefix, you have object markers, you also have subject markers, and in the stem, you have the classifier, the root, and stem variation. There are other components to the verb, which we will look at later, that occur both in the prefix and in the preverb. Let's shift our focus to an actual verb. If you were to look up a verb in a dictionary of Tlingit, you would see an entry that is similar to this, which it sometimes can be very confusing and can look very formulaic. But if you understand what you're looking at, you'll see that this is giving you all the information you need to begin conjugating this verb for person. To begin looking at this, let's look at each of these individual components, beginning with the verb root. The root is what you would look up if you encountered the verb and wanted to find its meaning, and it's often found near the end of the verb itself. In your studies of Tlingit, you have likely talked about vowel length and vowel tone. We have high tone, low tone, long vowels, and short vowels. And what we see is that they move regularly between high, low, long, and short in verb stems. Regardless of the stem's vowel length and tone, we usually start by looking up the stem long and low. So if your verb phrase were T'aḥdeintaan, Da would be your stem, but you would be looking up da, the long version. The area that this can get tricky is open vowels that change their shape when they end with a consonant. So da could become dane. A or u could become ain or ech. But you'll recognize these as you encounter them more over time. Next to the verb root, you're going to see the theme. The theme is the key to conjugating the verb. This is a method that was developed by Carrie Eggleston and Jeff Lear to code a verb in a certain way to show you what appears where and what you can substitute. Moving through these symbols one at a time, we start with the letter O, which is for object. In a verb phrase, the object is impacted by the verb and is not the subject. We'll look at a complete list of object pronouns and how they can be substituted in a moment. The next item is the conjugation prefix. Every Tlingit verb has a conjugation prefix, but it only shows up in certain verb forms. The 4 conjugation prefixes are na, ga, qa, and the 0 marker. We'll learn more about these in a later lesson. Next we have the letter S, which is for the subject. In a verb phrase, the subject is the agent in the verb. It is the one who performs the action. Like the object, we'll soon look at a list of subject pronouns that we can substitute in this slot. The next slot over is the classifier, which is often one of the most confusing parts of the Tlingit verb. Every Tlingit verb has a classifier that combines with the root to form the verb itself. It belongs to one of the groups on the right. We see the groups as 0, S, L, and SH. The classifier can move laterally on this chart between -I, +I, -D, and +D to specify certain verb forms and to change how the verb is functioning. As James Crippen explains, the root contains the meaning of the verb, and the classifier helps to tell you what the verb does. Next in the theme, we have the root. This is the core of the verb itself. The root contains the meaning. Some roots sound identical, but are different in meaning and are different roots. These appear as T1, T2, etc. The root combines with the classifier in various prefixes and preverbs to create meaning. The next item is stem variation. Every root belongs to a stem variation group. This group, the conjugation prefix, and verb mode determine the shape of the stem, which will be long and low, long and high, or short and high. There are irregular and invariable stems that do not follow patterns and need to be memorized, but most stems are fairly predictable. Next we have the verb type. Every Tlingit verb belongs to one of the 5 verb types: state, act, event, motion, and positional. The verb type determines how the verb behaves, including forms it can take and pronouns it will use. This will be discussed in future lessons. Going back to our verb listing, the next thing we see is the definition, which is listed below the verb root and the theme. In this one we have for S to look at, gaze at, watch O, or for S to watch, take care of, mind, look after, O. And in this case we go back to the theme, where S is the subject, O is the object. In some cases a verb might have multiple definitions, and we keep in mind that we are not looking at the definition of the verb root, but of the entire verb itself, which includes the classifier and any possible prefixes. The next thing we see in the Edwards Dictionary is 3 entries. In this case we have T'aḳdeintaan, T'aḥdeintaan, and T'aḥdeintaan. These are 3 different verb modes: perfective, which means the verb has already occurred, imperfective, which means the verb is occurring now, and repetitive imperfective, which means the verb occurs regularly. Keep in mind that a perfective verb means that the action has been completed, but it does not necessarily mean it was done in the past tense. Tlingit has a different sense of time and verbal action than English, and there are several cases of perfective verbs that refer to a present tense action. The last item we have here are sample sentences below. These are invaluable in seeing the verb in different forms and also seeing different cultural information that comes from fluent speakers. Now that we've covered the different aspects of what you see when looking up a verb, let's take a look at a verb with the fluent speaker, Keihéenák'w, John Martin, and all the different ways it could be conjugated for person. We'll look at this particular verb in the imperfective form.
T'axdeintaan, 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 T'axdeintaan.
This brings us back to our verb theme: object, conjugation prefix, subject, classifier, root, and verb type. It's important to memorize the order of this information so we can begin looking at what types of things we can substitute into these different slots. The Lear-Edwards theme works the same, except the conjugation prefix is moved outside of the verb and in front of the verb type. With that in mind, let's look at another verb, this one from Edwards' Dictionary of Tlingit. The verb root is chan. The imperfective form is asechan. She or he loves him, her, or it. If we expand our list of pronouns, this is what we have: a list of object pronouns, a list of subject pronouns, and a few preverb items that can alter those pronouns. One of the keys to conjugating verbs is memorizing these pronouns so you can identify them when you hear them and plug them into the right spaces when you're speaking. Verb themes may differ. Some verbs will not take an object, and so they do not have the letter O in the theme. Others will not take a subject, so they do not have the letter S in the theme. This lets you know what you can and cannot plug in so you can conjugate the verb. There are pronoun modifiers that can appear in the preverb section. These can alter the verbs in different ways. The first one is reflexive. This means the subject is doing the verb to hisself, herself, or itself. The second is reciprocal, which means multiple subjects are doing the verb together or doing the verb to each other. The third one can pluralize either the third person object or the third person subject, or both. This leads us back to the object pronouns. You'll notice that some of them have multiple forms. These are the ones with the tilde between them. This means it could be one or the other depending on the situation. For now, let's focus on the third person: her, him, or it. The first thing you see is a zero marker. This tells us that we're not going to hear anything, but we have to remember that something is there. We keep that in mind because it could shift into something else. This is something you're going to see throughout your studies of Tlingit grammar. For an example, we'll take a look at a sentence that many may be familiar with. You T'aḥdeintaan. You T'aḥdeintaan. You T'aḥdeintaan. First person, second person, third person, all using object pronouns. If we were to speak English with Tlingit grammar, we would say, I am called, you are called, is called. The third person pronoun would not be heard. Returning to the third person object pronoun, the zero marker will change to a in cases where you have a third person object, a third person subject, and nothing in the sentence that clearly marks a noun as a subject. This may sound complicated, but the object and subject are close together before the root of the verb, so if you had two zero markers, it would be impossible to tell that both of them were there. This brings us to our subject pronouns. You have this list of pronouns to commit to memory, so when you hear them, you recognize them, and when you speak, you know how to use them. Looking at this list, we'll begin to recognize the different combinations when we see them. One of the things is there are different components of the verb that can cause contraction, but we'll learn how to deal with that. The other thing is the existence of what we call the indefinite human and the indefinite non-human. The indefinite human object pronoun is qa or q and generally means the verb happens to people. The indefinite human subject is du and translates to the verb happens. Lastly, we have the indefinite human object pronoun ut. This can give special meaning to verbs, so keep an eye out for it as you continue to learn Tlingit. One of the last things we'll do in this section is look at the indefinite human pronoun. We'll take a look at how it affects meaning. The indefinite human subject pronoun means the verb happens. The indefinite human object pronoun means the verb happens to people. We'll hear these samples from Keihéenák'w.
Sheyu tuasak. Sheyu tuasak. Khatatu. Yutu. Ye yawuka. Ye yawduaka. Iin kakhwanik. Ka'in kakhwanik. Asikhan. Khusikhan. Yasatk. Khuyasatk.
We'll wrap up our discussion on object and subject pronouns by looking at all the possible combinations for the verb khan. That's the root, khan. The imperfective form of this verb is sekhan, which means to love. As you look at these conjugations, keep in mind that certain combinations may be culturally inappropriate in certain situations. You would not stand up in front of a group of people and say khat yi sekhan, you all love me, but you could say things like T'aḥdeintaan yi sekhani, I'm happy that you all love me. This would still sound boastful and incorrect to most elders, but keep in mind that these are exercises. These are presented to show you the combinations that are possible so you could begin recognizing them when you hear it and using them as you learn new verbs. So just keep in mind that when you're speaking Tlingit, you're trying not to boast about yourself or assume some other relationship is there. Instead, you affirm that relationship and talk about what it does to you spiritually or emotionally.
Khatsikhan. Ha-sikhan. Isikhan. Yisikhan. Asikhan. Khusikhan. Atsikhan. Khatsikhan. Tusikhan. Isikhan. Yisikhan. Asikhan. Tusikhan. iksihan, yiksihan, khasihan, at khasihan, akhla khasihan, siw khasihan, kha khasihan, khat isihan, ha isihan, at isihan, itla isihan, siw isihan, kha isihan, tusihan, at tusihan, siw tusihan, kha tusihan. Has khasihan, has tusihan, has isihan, has yisihan, has asihan, has khatsihan, has ha-sihan, has isihan, has asihan, shatsihan, shatsihan, shitihan, wush tutihan.
The Tlingit object and subject pronouns. You may have noticed some things about these verbs. Several of them would have the same form with different meanings. You'll learn later that there are different grammatical components that you can put into the sentence to specify which one is the subject and which one is the object. For now, we'll wrap up our lesson on objects and subjects. T'aḳdeintaan, T'aḥdeintaan, T'aḥdeintaan,